Remember these 50 Depression-era foods that kept families alive for under 5 cents in the Great Depression?
Back then, we didn't have much, but we made sure no one went hungry.
A time when mothers turned nothing into meals that saved their children from starvation. These weren't recipes, they were lifelines.
But around the corners wind the lengthening bread lines, and a whole new class of citizens appears in American society.
Every single one has vanished from our kitchens. We're bringing them back, starting now. Water pie sounds impossible, right? But in 1932, when a dozen eggs cost what most families earned in a day, mothers discovered something remarkable. Mix flour, sugar, water, butter, and vanilla. Bake it. The water creates its own syrup, transforming into custard without a single egg. Cost? 3 cents for an entire pie. Your grandmother made this on Sundays when she wanted to give you something sweet but had nothing in the cupboard. The magic happened in the oven, plain water becoming dessert. Today's bakers call it impossible. Depression, mothers called it Sunday dinner. Walk outside right now. See those yellow weeds you spray poison on? Your great-grandmother picked those for dinner. Not because she wanted to, because the grocery money was gone and the garden wasn't producing yet. She'd send children out with baskets at dawn, gathering tender leaves before flowers bloomed. Why dawn? Because that's when they're least bitter. She'd wash them 3 times, dress them with vinegar and bacon grease if she had any. One woman in Ohio fed her family dandelion salad for 2 weeks straight in April 1933. They survived. The neighbors who were too proud, some didn't. One hot dog, just one, sliced so thin you could see through it. A pound of potatoes, also sliced thin, fried together in whatever grease you'd saved. This fed a family of 4. The trick? Slice that hot dog thin enough that its flavor touches every piece of potato. Mothers became experts at making one piece of meat taste like a meal. The name itself was a joke. There was nothing funny about it. But you called it poor man's meal instead of all we have, because words mattered when dignity was all you had left. Prunes saved more lives than you'd think. While everyone talks about bread lines, nobody mentions the dried fruit that sat in pantries for months, waiting. Prunes didn't spoil, prunes were cheap, and prunes could become dessert. 1 bag of prunes, 25 cents, could make dessert for 2 weeks. Did it taste like chocolate cake? No. Did it keep children from crying about empty stomachs? Yes, that's the math of survival. One mother in Kentucky made this every single morning from 1930 to 1936. Same breakfast, every day. Her daughter remembered it 70 years later, said she still can't eat cornmeal without crying. But listen to this. That breakfast kept her alive to remember it. Cook cornmeal with water until thick. Pour it into a loaf pan. Let it sit overnight. Slice it and fry it crispy. That's breakfast for weeks, for months, for years. When you see milk toast on Depression menus, you're looking at rock bottom. This isn't food, it's the memory of food. Toast broken into pieces, warm milk poured over it. One woman wrote in her diary, "Made milk toast again. The children ate it without complaint. I cried in the kitchen." That's 1933 in one sentence. A pot of potato soup could feed a family for 3 days. 5 pounds of potatoes, 10 cents, 1 onion, 2 cents, water, free. That's 12 cents for 3 days of dinner. Mothers would make it thick on Monday. By Wednesday, they'd add more water. The potatoes were gone, but the memory of potatoes remained in that broth. Stop everything. Ritz crackers soaked in sugar syrup with lemon juice and cinnamon, baked in a pie crust. It tastes like apple pie. No apples involved. The chemistry is wild. The crackers absorb the syrup and somehow, impossibly, they take on the texture of cooked apples. Real apples? 50 cents. Mock apple pie? 15 cents. Bean sandwiches, mashed beans on bread. That's it. That's lunch. Children carried these to school in the 1930s. Other kids would know immediately. Bean sandwich meant your family was struggling. Some children would hide while eating them. But those beans provided protein when meat was impossible. Dignity is expensive. Survival is priceless. They named it after the president they blamed for everything. That's how angry people were. Whatever you could find thrown into a pot with water, hot dog pieces if you had them, pasta if you had it. The result? Thin, barely flavored soup. But the name, that was protest. Every time a mother served Hoover stew, she was making a political statement. Question for you. How many of these foods did your family eat? Drop a number in the comments. Let's see who remembers the most. No yeast, no rising, just flour, baking powder, sugar, milk, and peanut butter mixed into a quick bread that baked in an hour. One loaf could be breakfast for 3 days. The density of this bread is shocking. It's heavy, compact, more like a brick than bread. But that density meant it filled you up. One slice felt like 2. That's not cooking. That's survival engineering. Community happened here, everyone contributing whatever they had to one big pot. You bring a carrot, I bring an onion. She brings a potato, he brings a soup bone. We all eat. This started in hobo camps, but spread to neighborhoods where everyone was struggling. One pot, one community. When you don't have enough dough to make a full loaf, you fry pieces of it. The outside gets crispy. The inside stays soft. If you have sugar, you sprinkle it on top. In better times, those scraps might have been thrown away. In the Depression, those scraps became snacks for children who were always hungry. One head of cabbage could become a week of soup. Monday, thick cabbage soup with potatoes. Tuesday, same soup, add more water. Wednesday, even more water, but the cabbage flavor is still there. Thursday, mostly water now, but you call it soup. One mother kept a detailed diary of her cabbage soup in 1932. 7 days. One head of cabbage, family of 5. They all survived. No eggs, no milk, no butter, just flour, sugar, cocoa, vinegar, and oil. Mix it, bake it, eat it. It's actually good, moist, chocolatey, real. The vinegar reacts with baking soda to make it rise. This recipe spread like wildfire in the 1930s. 3 ingredients: potatoes, onions, fat for frying. That's dinner. The onions get sweet, the potatoes get crispy, and for a moment you forget that this is poverty food. You're just eating something hot and tasty. Those moments of forgetting, of just enjoying food, kept people sane when everything else was insane. Here it is, number 17, the one that shows you how bad it really got. Flour browned in fat, water added. That's gravy. Poured over bread. That's dinner. No meat, no vegetables, just flour, fat, water, bread. This is what mothers made when everything else was gone. Children ate this and went to bed. Mothers served this and cried, but the family survived another day. Canned beans mashed between bread, cold or heated, didn't matter. This was lunch for millions of American children in the 1930s. Teachers could identify struggling families by the lunches children brought. Cornmeal cooked in water until thick and creamy. That's breakfast, every morning, for years. Imagine eating the same breakfast every single day for 5 years. Same taste, same texture, same reminder that things hadn't gotten better yet. Yes, soup made with oatmeal. Oats added to vegetable broth to make it thicker, more filling. The oats would absorb the liquid and swell, turning thin soup into something substantial. This technique came from European immigrants who knew how to stretch food. Think you've seen everything? The next 10 foods get even more desperate. And number 28, grandmothers saved it in a can and used it for everything. Sliced pickles between bread, nothing else. The pickles provided flavor and crunch that made plain bread more bearable. But everyone knew what pickle sandwiches meant. They meant your family had nothing. Yesterday's mashed potatoes mixed with flour formed into patties, fried until crispy. This is how you made leftovers into a new meal. Remember that potato soup from earlier? This is what you did with any potatoes left over. Same potatoes, different form. That psychological variety mattered when families were eating potatoes at every meal. Cooked rice mixed with milk and sugar, hot or cold, breakfast or dessert or dinner. Some families served this 3 times a day during the worst months. Rice and milk for breakfast, rice and milk for lunch, rice and milk for dinner. The monotony was numbing, but the alternative was hunger. And when those are your choices, you choose monotony every time. When sugar cost too much, molasses provided sweetness at half the price. 1 jar of molasses could make dozens of cookies. The smell of molasses cookies baking could make a family forget, just for a moment, how hard everything had become. My grandmother always said, "If you can still smell cookies baking, you haven't lost everything." She was right. Boiled dinner, everything in one pot: potatoes, cabbage, carrots, turnips, and if you were blessed, a small piece of salt pork. Simmer it for hours. Feed the family for days. The pot would sit on the back of the stove, ready to be reheated. By day 3, it was more soup than dinner. By day 4, it was mostly memory, but it was hot and it was food. Butter spread on bread, sprinkled with sugar. This is what mothers made when the cupboard was completely empty and children were crying from hunger. This is rock-bottom food, and yet children who ate sugar sandwiches in the 1930s remember them fondly, not because they were good, but because they represented mothers who refused to let their children go to bed with nothing. When you can't afford meat for gravy, you use tomatoes. Flour browned in fat, canned tomatoes added, cooked until thick. Remember that potato soup and those fried potatoes? This gravy made them actually taste like something. 1 can of tomatoes could make enough gravy for multiple meals. Southern versions were spicier, Midwestern versions were milder, but all of them shared the same goal: making plain food taste like something. Shredded cabbage fried in fat until it caramelizes and wilts. The cooking process brings out natural sweetness. The result is actually delicious: sweet, savory, tender. 1 head of cabbage cost a nickel and could provide side dishes for a week. When everything else was uncertain, cabbage was dependable. And dependability was worth more than variety. Stale bread wasn't thrown away. It became dessert, torn into pieces, soaked in milk and eggs if you had them, baked until set. This transformed waste into something families could look forward to. Even plain bread pudding felt like dessert, felt like someone cared enough to make something special. That emotional value was as important as the calories. Cornmeal, water, salt, mix it, fry it, eat it. These simple pancakes had fed colonists and pioneers, and they came back to feed Depression families. Americans had survived hard times before with Johnny Cakes. They would survive this time, too. The recipe was 200 years old. The hunger was new, but the solution was ancient. We're past 30 foods, and the next section? These are the ones that prove how creative desperation makes you. This sounds impossible. Mashed potatoes mixed with powdered sugar until it forms a sweet, fudge-like candy. The potato provides structure without adding potato flavor. 1 potato could make enough candy for the whole family. The mixture would be rolled out, spread with peanut butter, rolled up, and sliced. This was kitchen magic, turning a vegetable into dessert. Children didn't need to know how it was made. They just needed something sweet. Heated milk with bread torn into it, maybe sugar, maybe salt. This is what you ate when you had nothing else, when the pantry was empty, when the money was gone. Milk soup appeared at the end, the last meal before someone figured out how to get more food. It's barely food. It's mostly memory of food. But it's warm, and it's liquid, and it goes into empty stomachs. Real coffee became a luxury, so families made substitutes. Dandelion roots dug up, washed, chopped, roasted until dark, then ground and brewed. It didn't taste like coffee, but it was hot and dark and bitter, and that was close enough. That morning, ritual mattered, starting the day with something hot, something familiar, something that reminded you of normal times. When a pig was butchered, nothing was wasted. The crispy bits left from rendering lard, cracklins, went into cornbread batter. Cracklins were essentially free, a byproduct of making lard, but they transformed plain cornbread into something special, finding value in what others might throw away, making luxury from scraps, creating something from nothing. A few apples, stretched with breadcrumbs and sugar, baked until the breadcrumbs absorbed the apple juice. This made 3 apples feed a family of 6. The breadcrumbs were made from stale bread that would have been thrown away, but the result was genuine dessert that felt abundant, even though it was made from almost nothing. The next 5 foods? They're the ones grandmothers refuse to talk about, too painful, too real, but we need to remember them. Dried lima beans soaked overnight, simmered all day with water and salt. 1 pound of beans could make soup for days. The preparation required planning. You had to remember to soak the beans the night before. Depression mothers became experts at thinking ahead, at preparing today for tomorrow's hunger. In 1933, lima bean soup appeared on 4.2 million American tables every single week. Sugar boiled with vinegar until it reached hard crack stage, then pulled until light and airy. Making taffy became a family activity, everyone taking turns pulling the hot candy. The process created entertainment as well as treats, and entertainment was scarce during the Depression, so vinegar taffy provided both sweetness and something to do, both calories and memories. But let me tell you what really happened in those kitchens when taffy-making day arrived. Mothers would announce it the night before. Tomorrow we're making taffy, and children would go to bed excited, which was rare during years when excitement was a luxury most families couldn't afford. The anticipation mattered almost as much as the candy itself. The recipe was deceptively simple. 2 cups of sugar, carefully measured because sugar was expensive at 10 cents for 2 pounds, 1 cup of water, half a cup of vinegar, the same vinegar used for everything from pickling to cleaning, a tablespoon of butter if you had it. The ingredients would go into the largest pot the family owned, usually a heavy cast-iron vessel that had been passed down through generations. The cooking process required constant attention. You couldn't walk away, couldn't get distracted. The sugar mixture had to reach exactly 260 degrees Fahrenheit, the hard crack stage. Too cool and the taffy would be sticky and soft. Too hot and it would become brittle and break. Depression mothers became experts at testing candy temperature without thermometers, which most families couldn't afford. They'd drop a bit of the hot syrup into cold water. If it formed hard, brittle threads, it was ready. If it formed a soft ball, it needed more time. Getting to hard crack stage took patience. The pot would sit on the stove for 20 to 30 minutes, bubbling and hissing, filling the kitchen with the sharp scent of boiling vinegar and the sweet smell of caramelizing sugar. That smell would drift through the house, announcing to everyone that something special was happening. Neighbors might smell it too, and they'd know that family was making taffy today. That family had sugar to spare. Once the mixture reached the right temperature, it had to be poured immediately. Mothers would grease a large pan, usually with that precious lard or bacon grease, and pour the hot syrup in a thin layer. Then came the dangerous part. The syrup was hot enough to cause serious burns. Children were warned to stay back, to wait, to be patient just a little longer. The cooling process was crucial. The taffy had to cool enough to handle but stay warm enough to pull. Too cool, and it would harden into an unworkable mass. The timing was everything. Experienced mothers knew exactly when to start, when the edges of the candy had cooled enough to touch, but the center was still warm and pliable. Then the real work began, the pulling. Mothers would grease their hands with butter or lard, then grab a portion of the warm taffy. The first pulls were difficult. The candy was still quite hot and very sticky. But as you pulled and folded, something magical happened. The taffy began to change. It lightened in color, going from dark amber to pale gold. It became more opaque. More importantly, it became lighter and airier. The pulling process took time, 15 to 20 minutes of constant work. Your arms would get tired, your hands would get sticky despite the grease, but you couldn't stop. If you stopped pulling before the taffy was ready, it would harden into a dense, chewy mass instead of the light, airy candy it was supposed to become. As the taffy lightened and became more pliable, someone, usually the father, would begin to twist it into long ropes. These ropes would be laid on the greased pan, and then came the final step, cutting. Using greased kitchen scissors, the taffy rope would be snipped into bite-sized pieces. Each piece would be wrapped in waxed paper, carefully saved from bread wrappers, or purchased specifically for this purpose. The wrapped candies would be stored in a tin, rationed out over the following weeks. 1 piece after dinner if you'd been good, 2 pieces on Sunday as a special treat. The tin would sit on a high shelf, and children would know it was there, would think about it, would look forward to those rare moments when Mother would reach up and bring it down. But vinegar taffy provided more than just candy. It provided an event. During the Depression, when there was no money for movies, no money for entertainment of any kind, making taffy was something to do. It was an activity that brought the family together, that required cooperation, that created a shared experience. Fathers who were discouraged from unemployment found purpose in pulling taffy with their children. Mothers who were exhausted from worry found a few moments of normalcy in teaching their daughters the technique their own mothers had taught them. The taffy pulling also served a social function. Sometimes families would invite neighbors over for taffy pulling parties. Everyone would contribute a little sugar, a little vinegar, and together they'd make enough taffy for all the families involved. The adults would talk while they pulled, sharing news, offering support, maintaining the social bonds that kept communities together during impossible times. Children from taffy pulling parties would remember those evenings for the rest of their lives, not because the candy was so delicious, though it was good, but because of what it represented. In the middle of poverty, in the middle of hardship, their parents had created joy, had created sweetness, had created a memory of laughter and sticky hands, and the satisfying stretch of warm taffy between small fingers. The vinegar in the recipe served a practical purpose beyond flavor. It prevented the sugar from crystallizing, ensuring smooth candy instead of grainy results. But it also added a subtle tang that balanced the sweetness, making the taffy more interesting than plain sugar candy would have been. That complexity, sweet with a hint of sour, somehow seemed appropriate for Depression treats. Nothing was purely sweet anymore. Everything had an edge. Some families would add flavoring if they had it. A few drops of peppermint extract turned the taffy into something special. Vanilla made it taste richer, but most families made it plain, letting the caramelized sugar and vinegar provide all the flavor. And it was enough. More than enough. The cost of making vinegar taffy was remarkably low. The sugar was the expensive part, about 5 cents worth per batch. The vinegar cost less than a penny. The butter was optional. For roughly 5 cents, a family could make enough taffy to provide treats for weeks. Compare that to store-bought candy, which cost a penny per piece, and the economy becomes clear. Homemade taffy was affordable luxury, but perhaps the most important thing about vinegar taffy was what it taught children about making do, about creating something from almost nothing, about finding joy in simple things. Children who pulled taffy during the Depression grew up understanding that entertainment didn't have to be expensive, that family time didn't require money, that sweetness could be created at home with basic ingredients and willing hands. Vinegar taffy, 5 cents worth of ingredients, 30 minutes of work, a lifetime of memories. That's Depression mathematics at its finest. bacon grease, or lard spread on bread. Nothing else. This appeared when butter was gone and there was nothing else to put on bread. It wasn't about taste. It was about adding fat and calories to plain bread. Children ate this without complaint because they understood this was all there was. The grease would be spread thin, carefully rationed. Lard sandwiches even starker than grease bread. Lard, solid, white, flavorless, spread between two slices of bread, sometimes salted, usually plain. This is what children took to school when there was absolutely nothing else. The sandwiches announced poverty louder than words ever could. Teachers would see them and know. Other children would see them and understand. But those children ate them anyway because hungry is worse than embarrassed. Mashed potatoes mixed with onions formed into patties, fried until golden, called fish cakes, even though they contained no fish. The name was aspirational, a reminder of real fish cakes that families used to afford. The taste was nothing like fish, but the name let you pretend, and pretending mattered when reality was too harsh. We're past 40 foods. If you're still watching, comment "survived." And tell me which state your Depression family was from. I'm building that map. Tiny dumplings made by mixing flour with just enough water to make it crumbly, then pinching off bits and dropping them into potato soup. Remember that potato soup from way back at number 7? This is how you made it stretch even further. The rivels cooked in the soup, absorbing flavor. Children could help make rivels, pinching off bits of dough. The word rivel came from German immigrants who brought the technique to America generations before the Depression. In German, reiben means to rub or grate, which described exactly how these tiny dumplings were made. You'd rub flour and water together between your fingers until the mixture formed small, irregular crumbs. These crumbs, rivels, would be dropped into boiling soup where they'd cook into soft, chewy bits that added substance without adding cost. During the Depression, rivels became essential kitchen knowledge. When a pot of potato soup was too thin to satisfy hungry stomachs, rivels transformed it into something more filling. When the soup had to feed more people than anticipated, rivels stretched it further. When children needed to feel full enough to sleep through the night, rivels made that possible. The technique was deceptively simple but required practice to master. You'd put flour in a bowl, usually about 1 cup for a large pot of soup. Add water gradually, just a tablespoon or 2 at a time. Too much water and you'd get dough instead of rivels. Too little and the flour wouldn't bind at all. The goal was a mixture that was barely damp, just wet enough that when you rubbed it between your fingers, it formed small clumps. Depression mothers would stand at their stoves, one hand working the flour mixture, the other holding a wooden spoon to stir the soup. They'd pinch off bits of the crumbly mixture and drop them directly into the boiling soup. The rivels would sink initially, then rise as they cooked, expanding slightly as they absorbed liquid. Within 5 minutes, they'd be done, soft enough to eat, but still maintaining some texture, some bite. The beauty of rivels was their efficiency. They required no eggs, no milk, no fat, just flour and water, 2 ingredients that even the poorest families usually had. A cup of flour cost less than 2 cents. The water was free. For 2 cents, you could transform a thin soup that barely satisfied into a thick, filling meal that kept stomachs quiet and children content. But rivels provided something beyond just bulk. They absorbed the soup's flavor as they cooked, becoming tiny flavor bombs scattered throughout the pot. Each rivel tasted like concentrated potato soup, carrying the essence of whatever seasonings had been added. That flavor concentration made the soup taste richer than it actually was, creating the illusion of abundance when abundance was impossible. Making rivels became a task that mothers shared with their children. It was one of the few cooking activities that small hands could manage safely. No hot pans to worry about, no sharp knives required, just flour, water, and fingers. Children would stand on chairs beside their mothers, pinching off bits of the crumbly mixture and dropping them into the pot. "Not too big," mothers would instruct. "About the size of a pea. That's right. Good job." Those moments of working together mattered. They gave children a sense of usefulness during times when feeling useful was rare. They taught basic cooking skills that would serve those children throughout their lives. And they created memories, not always happy memories, but memories of working together, of contributing, of being part of the family's survival. The texture of rivels varied depending on how they were made. Some mothers made them very small, creating almost a grain-like addition to the soup. Others made them larger, more like tiny dumplings. Some rubbed the mixture vigorously, creating uniform crumbs. Others pinched it more gently, creating irregular pieces that gave the soup varied texture. There was no single correct way. Each family developed their own technique, their own preferred size and consistency. Rivels appeared in other soups beyond potato. They went into bean soup, vegetable soup, even plain broth, when broth was all there was. They were particularly valuable in chicken soup on the rare occasions when a family had chicken. Depression mothers learned to judge the timing perfectly, adding rivels about 10 minutes before the soup would be served. That gave them enough time to cook through while maintaining their texture. Some families added an egg to their rivel mixture when eggs were available. The egg made the rivels richer, gave them a better texture and a golden color. But eggs were expensive, and most families saved them for occasions when eggs themselves were the meal. Plain rivels, just flour and water, were the norm, not the exception. The economic impact of rivels was significant in Depression households. A pot of soup that might have fed a family one meal could be stretched to 2 meals with the addition of rivels. Soup that would have left everyone still hungry could satisfy with rivels added. That stretching ability meant the difference between making it to the next payday and running out of food before money came in. Rivels also solved a practical problem in Depression cooking: how to make soup filling without using precious ingredients. Potatoes were cheap but still cost money. Beans required soaking and long cooking. Rivels required almost nothing and cooked in minutes. When you needed to add substance to soup right now, when hungry children couldn't wait for beans to soak overnight, rivels were the answer. The cultural significance of rivels extended beyond their practical value. They represented the blending of immigrant food traditions with American necessity. German techniques, passed down through generations, became survival tools for families of all backgrounds. The Depression created a kind of forced culinary democracy, where ethnic foods became American foods, where traditional recipes became survival strategies available to everyone. Children who grew up eating rivels had strong associations with them. Some remembered them fondly as comfort food, as something warm and filling that appeared when they were hungry. Others remembered them as poverty food, as a reminder of times when there wasn't enough. Those different memories reflected different family experiences. Some families managed to maintain warmth and love despite poverty, while others were broken by it. Today, rivels have largely disappeared from American cooking. Most people have never heard of them. Those who have often associate them with Pennsylvania Dutch cuisine, unaware that they were once widespread across the country, found in Depression kitchens from coast to coast. The technique has been lost, the knowledge forgotten. The tiny dumplings vanished from our collective memory. But in Depression kitchens, rivels were everywhere. They were in the soup pot every week, sometimes every day. They represented ingenuity and efficiency, the ability to create something from almost nothing. They proved that with basic ingredients and simple techniques, mothers could feed their families even when circumstances made feeding families seem impossible. Rivels weren't fancy, they weren't impressive, but they worked. And during the Depression, working was all that mattered. When you don't have enough dough for bread and no filling for pastries, you fry pieces and sprinkle them with sugar. The dough puffs up, gets crispy outside and soft inside. Sugar sticks to the warm surface. This appeared on Sundays when mothers wanted to give children something that felt celebratory. Those fried pieces of dough said, "You matter," to children who needed to hear it. Small white beans simmered until they create their own creamy broth. This soup appeared on tables across America multiple times a week. Navy bean soup could be made thick or thin, depending on how far it needed to stretch. It provided protein that kept families functioning when meat was a distant memory. By 1934, navy beans had become the single most purchased food item in America. That statistic tells you everything you need to know about the Depression. Navy beans, small, white, unremarkable, outsold every other food in the country. Not bread, not flour, not potatoes, navy beans, because navy beans provided what desperate families needed most: cheap protein that lasted forever and could be transformed into meals that filled stomachs and kept bodies functioning. A pound of navy beans cost 7 cents in 1934. That pound, when soaked and cooked properly, would expand to nearly 3 pounds of cooked beans. 1 pound could make enough soup to feed a family of 5 for 2 days. Do the math, that's less than a penny per person per meal. No other protein source came close to that economy. Not eggs, not cheese, certainly not meat. Navy beans were survival measured in pennies. The beans themselves were small, oval, and pure white. They got their name from being a staple of the U.S. Navy since the mid-1800s. What worked for sailors worked for Depression families. Both groups needed food that wouldn't spoil, that provided complete nutrition, and that cost almost nothing. Making navy bean soup became a weekly ritual in Depression households. Usually on Monday, after Sunday's larger dinner had been eaten and cleared away, mothers would pull out their bag of navy beans. They'd measure out a pound or two, depending on how many people needed feeding and how long the soup needed to last. The beans would be spread on a clean dish towel and carefully examined. Any stones or debris would be removed, a crucial step because biting down on a stone could crack a tooth, and dentists were an impossible luxury. The cleaned beans would go into a large bowl and be covered with cold water. They'd soak overnight, absorbing water and beginning to soften. By morning, they'd have doubled in size, plump and ready for cooking. That soaking step was essential. Unsoaked beans took hours longer to cook, wasting precious fuel. Soaking also made the beans more digestible, reducing the gas and bloating that came from eating large quantities of legumes. The next morning, the soaked beans would be drained and rinsed, then transferred to the largest pot the family owned. Fresh water would be added, enough to cover the beans by several inches. An onion, if the family had one. A bay leaf if they'd saved one, a ham bone if they'd been fortunate enough to have ham recently, though most families hadn't. Salt and pepper, that was it. The pot would go on the stove and begin its long simmer. Navy bean soup couldn't be rushed. It required hours of gentle cooking for the beans to soften completely and release their starches into the cooking liquid. As the beans cooked, they'd break down, creating a naturally creamy broth without any cream, without any milk, without any expensive dairy products. The starches from the beans themselves would thicken the soup, turning plain water into something that looked and felt substantial. Depression mothers learned to judge the soup's progress by sound and smell. The gentle bubbling would fill the kitchen with the earthy scent of cooking beans. After 2 hours, the beans would be tender but still holding their shape. After 3 hours, some would begin to break down, releasing their starches. After 4 hours, the soup would be thick and creamy, individual beans soft enough to mash against the roof of your mouth with your tongue. The beauty of navy bean soup was its flexibility. When the family was smaller or money was slightly less tight, the soup could be made thick, more beans than broth, substantial enough to be almost a stew. When the family was larger or money was tighter, more water could be added, stretching the same beans into more servings. The soup adapted to circumstances, which made it perfect for Depression cooking where circumstances changed constantly. Navy bean soup could be eaten plain, just beans and broth in a bowl. It could be served over bread, the bread soaking up the creamy liquid. It could be eaten with crackers if the family had them. Some mothers would add a bit of vinegar at the table, the acidity brightening the earthy bean flavor. Others would stir in a spoonful of bacon grease, adding richness. without adding cost. The soup reheated beautifully, which was crucial for Depression families who couldn't afford to cook fresh meals multiple times a day. A pot of navy bean soup made on Monday would appear at dinner Monday night, at lunch Tuesday, at dinner Tuesday night, at lunch Wednesday. Each time it was reheated, it would thicken slightly, the beans breaking down further. By Wednesday, it might be thick enough to eat with a fork rather than a spoon. That thickness could be adjusted by adding water. Too thick? Add water and reheat. Need to stretch it further? Add more water. The soup was forgiving, adaptable, willing to be whatever the family needed it to be on any given day. That flexibility made it invaluable when unpredictability was the only predictable thing about Depression life. Navy bean soup provided nutrition that went beyond just calories. The beans were rich in protein, not as much as meat, but enough to keep bodies functioning. They provided fiber that kept digestive systems working despite monotonous diets. They contained iron, folate, and other vitamins that prevented some of the deficiency diseases that threatened families eating mostly starches. That nutritional density meant navy bean soup wasn't just filling, it was actually keeping people healthy. Children who grew up eating navy bean soup multiple times a week developed complicated feelings about it. The soup also created a kind of culinary democracy during the Depression. Rich and poor alike were eating navy bean soup. The wealthy might add more ham, might use better quality beans, might serve it in finer bowls, but they were still eating bean soup because bean soup was what made economic sense. That shared experience, everyone eating the same basic foods, created a sense of collective hardship that united the country in ways prosperity never had. Navy bean soup appeared in institutional settings, too. School cafeterias served it. Church basements served it at community dinners. Soup kitchens served it to the unemployed and homeless. The soup became a symbol of the Depression itself, plain, filling, unremarkable, but essential. It kept people alive. That's not poetic. That's not romantic. But it's true. By 1934, when navy beans became America's most purchased food, the soup had evolved from occasional meal to dietary staple. Families were eating it 3, 4, 5 times a week. Some families ate it more often than that. The monotony was crushing, but the alternative was hunger, and hunger was worse than monotony. The soup also facilitated a kind of food sharing in Depression communities. When one family made a large pot of navy bean soup, they might share some with neighbors who were struggling even more. That sharing created social bonds that helped communities survive. The soup became a medium of exchange, a way of helping each other without money changing hands, a reminder that even in poverty, generosity was possible. Today, navy bean soup has largely disappeared from American tables. We eat it occasionally, perhaps, but not as a staple, not as a necessity. We've forgotten what our grandparents knew, that navy beans could keep families fed through impossible times, that simple soup could provide complete nutrition, that 7 cents could buy survival. But in Depression kitchens, navy bean soup was everywhere, on Monday, on Tuesday, on Wednesday, thick or thin, with ham or without, served over bread or eaten plain. The soup was constant, reliable, essential. It proved that survival didn't require fancy ingredients or complicated techniques. Sometimes survival just required beans, water, time, and the determination to keep cooking, keep eating, keep going. Navy bean soup wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And during the Depression, working was everything. The absolute bottom, flour browned in fat, water added. That's it. No milk, no meat, just flour, fat, water. This is what you made when you had exhausted every other option, when the beans were gone, when the potatoes were finished. Mothers would brown that flour carefully, trying to create flavor from nothing, then add water and pretend it was gravy. Gravy, white gravy made from flour, fat, and milk when you had it, water when you didn't, thick, peppery, poured over biscuits for breakfast. This came from lumber camps where workers needed cheap, filling food. But here's the difference from water gravy. Sawmill gravy had pepper, lots of it. That pepper made it taste like something intentional, not something desperate. That psychological difference mattered. Only 5 foods left, and the last one? It'll haunt you. When apples were cheap during harvest season, mothers would fry them in fat with sugar and cinnamon. The cooking caramelized the natural sugars, creating something that felt like dessert. Apples stored well through winter in cool cellars. When fried, even apples that were starting to soften became delicious. Buying apples when they were cheap, storing them carefully, using them throughout the year, that planning was essential to Depression survival. Cornmeal batter fried into small cakes, crispy outside and soft inside. These could be breakfast with syrup, dinner with beans, or snacks with nothing. Remember that cornmeal mush and cornmeal porridge? This is what you made when you were desperate for variety. Same cornmeal, different form. That difference mattered psychologically. Corn fritters weren't cornbread. They weren't corn mush. They were something different, and different was valuable when every meal felt the same. Leftover mashed potatoes mixed with just enough flour to hold together formed into dumplings. The dumplings would float when done, soft and pillowy. They stretched yesterday's potatoes into today's meal, making old things seem new, making little seem like enough, making survival look like living. Nothing was wasted in a Depression kitchen, not a scrap, not a crumb, certainly not leftover mashed potatoes. When dinner ended and a small amount of potatoes remained in the bowl, those potatoes didn't go in the trash. They went into a covered dish and into the icebox if you had one, or into a cool spot in the cellar if you didn't, because tomorrow those potatoes would become something else entirely. Potato dumplings represented one of the most ingenious transformations in Depression cooking. Yesterday's side dish became today's main course. Yesterday's accompaniment became today's sustenance. The alchemy was simple but profound. Add just enough flour to bind the cold mashed potatoes, form them into small balls, and drop them into boiling water or simmering soup. Within minutes, they'd float to the surface, signaling they were done. The technique itself was old, brought to America by German and Eastern European immigrants who had been making Kartoffelklöße and similar dumplings for generations. But during the Depression, this ethnic specialty became widespread survival food. Neighbors shared the technique over back fences. Women taught it at church socials. Children learned it at their mothers' sides, small hands helping to roll the potato mixture into uniform balls. The ratio mattered. Too much flour and the dumplings became heavy, dense, almost inedible. Too little flour, and they'd fall apart in the boiling water, turning into a starchy mess. Depression mothers developed an instinct for the right proportion, usually about 1 cup of flour for every 2 cups of cold mashed potatoes. But they didn't measure. They felt it, added flour gradually, working it in with their hands until the mixture felt right. That tactile knowledge, passed from generation to generation, couldn't be written in a recipe. It had to be learned through practice. The process of making potato dumplings became a quiet meditation in Depression kitchens. Mothers would stand at their tables, flour dusting their hands, rolling small portions of the potato mixture between their palms. Roll, place on a floured board, roll another. The repetitive motion was soothing in lives that had very little that was soothing. The dumplings would line up in neat rows, waiting to be cooked. Some mothers added an egg to the mixture if they had one to spare. The egg made the dumplings richer, gave them a better texture. But eggs were expensive, 30 cents a dozen, and most families couldn't spare one for dumplings when that egg could be scrambled and stretched across breakfast for the whole family. So, most potato dumplings were made without eggs, just potatoes, flour, and salt, the trinity of Depression cooking. The cooking method varied by household and by what else was being prepared. Some mothers would boil the dumplings in salted water, then serve them with a bit of butter if they had it, or with the bacon grease that sat in a can beside every depression stove. Others would drop the dumplings directly into soup, particularly potato soup, creating a meal that was potatoes all the way through but somehow felt more substantial because of the variety of textures. The dumplings would sink to the bottom of the pot when first added. Then, as they cooked, they'd slowly rise. Watching for that moment when they floated to the surface became a task often given to children. Watch the pot. Tell me when they float. It gave children something to do, made them feel useful, taught them the basics of cooking through observation and participation. When the dumplings floated, they were done. Overcooked dumplings became mushy and unpleasant. Undercooked dumplings had a raw flour taste that nobody wanted. The window of perfect doneness was brief, maybe 2 minutes after they floated. Depression mothers learned to time it perfectly, pulling the dumplings from the water with a slotted spoon the moment they were ready. The texture of a properly made potato dumpling was something special. The outside would be slightly firm, almost silky. The inside would be soft, almost fluffy, despite being made from dense mashed potatoes. Boiled and served with butter or gravy, they were a side dish. Added to soup, they became part of the main course. Fried the next day in a bit of fat, they transformed again into something crispy and completely different. One batch of dumplings could appear in 3 different meals, each time tasting different enough that children wouldn't complain about eating the same thing repeatedly. The economics of potato dumplings were remarkable. The leftover potatoes cost nothing. They were already paid for, already cooked, already served once. The flour added maybe a penny's worth of cost. For essentially 1 penny, a mother could create enough dumplings to feed her family. That return on investment was impossible to beat. But potato dumplings provided more than just cheap calories. They provided psychological value that's harder to quantify. Taking yesterday's leftovers and transforming them into something that felt new gave mothers a sense of accomplishment. It proved that with skill and knowledge, scarcity could be overcome, that creativity could triumph over poverty, that they could still provide for their families even when circumstances seemed impossible. Children who grew up eating potato dumplings during the Depression had complicated relationships with them as adults. Some refused to eat them ever again, the taste too closely associated with hardship and hunger. Others sought them out, made them for their own children and grandchildren, wanting to pass on not just the recipe, but the lesson it represented, that resourcefulness matters, that waste is inexcusable, that old things can become new again with a little effort and imagination. The technique of making potato dumplings also taught broader lessons about Depression survival. It taught planning. You had to think ahead, had to save those leftover potatoes instead of throwing them away. It taught patience. The dumplings couldn't be rushed, had to be formed carefully, cooked at the right temperature for the right amount of time. It taught adaptability. The basic recipe could be modified based on what you had available, could be served in different ways depending on what else was being prepared. In some families, making potato dumplings became a weekly ritual. Every Monday, after Sunday's larger dinner had been eaten and cleared away, mothers would make dumplings from whatever potatoes remained. Those dumplings would appear in Monday's soup, providing substance and variety in a meal that might otherwise have been thin and unsatisfying. Today, potato dumplings have largely disappeared from American tables. We throw away leftover mashed potatoes without a second thought. We've lost the knowledge that those leftovers could become something else, something good, something worth eating. But in Depression kitchens, potato dumplings were everywhere. They were proof that nothing had to be wasted, that skill and knowledge could stretch resources further than seemed possible, that yesterday's leftovers could become today's meal, that old things could seem new, that little could seem like enough, that survival with enough creativity and determination could look almost like living. also called desperation pie for obvious reasons. Sugar, cream or milk, flour, butter, baked in a pie crust. No eggs required. Unlike many Depression foods, sugar cream pie didn't disappear when prosperity returned. It became a regional tradition in Indiana, proof that some good things can come from hard times. People still make it today, not from necessity, but from memory. The recipe emerged when eggs became too expensive for most families to use in baking. Traditional custard pies required half a dozen eggs. Sugar cream pie required none. That absence of eggs made it possible when nothing else was. The filling was deceptively simple. Sugar mixed with flour to prevent graininess, combined with cream or milk, dotted with butter, all poured into a pie shell and baked until it set into a creamy, sweet custard. The magic happened in the oven. As the pie baked, the sugar would caramelize slightly on top, creating a golden crust that crackled when you cut into it. Beneath that crust, the filling would set into something between pudding and custard, soft, sweet, with a texture that melted on your tongue. The butter would create small pockets of richness throughout. The result was a pie that tasted far more luxurious than its humble ingredients suggested. Indiana claimed sugar cream pie as its own, calling it Hoosier pie. But the truth is, variations appeared across the Midwest wherever families were struggling. Some versions used brown sugar instead of white, creating a deeper, more molasses-like flavor. Others added vanilla extract when they had it, or nutmeg for warmth. The basic principle remained the same: create sweetness without eggs. Making sugar cream pie became a marker of resourcefulness. When a mother served sugar cream pie, everyone understood. Eggs were too expensive this week, but there would still be dessert. The pie said, "We're managing," even when managing was barely possible. It maintained the ritual of Sunday dinner dessert when traditional pies were out of reach. The pie had another advantage. It was quick. No lengthy preparation, no complicated techniques. Mix the filling, pour it in a crust, bake it 45 minutes from start to finish. That speed mattered when mothers were exhausted from worry and work, when fuel for the oven was expensive and had to be conserved, when time itself felt like a luxury nobody could afford. Made it for their own children decades later. What's remarkable is that sugar cream pie survived. Most Depression foods disappeared the moment people could afford better options. Nobody continued eating dandelion salad or water gravy by choice, but sugar cream pie persisted. Bakeries in Indiana still make it. Families still serve it at holidays. Food writers still feature it in articles about regional American desserts. Why did it survive when other Depression foods didn't? Because it was actually good. Not just adequate, not just acceptable, actually delicious. The simplicity that made it economical also made it elegant. The sweetness that made it affordable also made it satisfying. Sugar cream pie proved that poverty doesn't always produce inferior results. Sometimes limitation forces creativity that produces something worth keeping. Today, when people make sugar cream pie, they're not making desperation food. They're making tradition. They're connecting to a past when their grandparents survived impossible circumstances with intelligence and determination. They're proving that some good things really do come from hard times, and they're keeping alive the memory of Depression mothers who refused to let their families go without sweetness, even when sweetness seemed impossible. Dried corn kernels treated with lye, then dried again. Hominy cost 5 cents a pound and lasted forever on the shelf. Southern families knew hominy as survival food. It could be boiled into grits for breakfast, added to soups for bulk, or fried as a side dish. The lye treatment made the corn more digestible and released nutrients that regular corn kept locked away. 1 pound of hominy, properly stretched, could provide side dishes for a week. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't exciting, but it was reliable, cheap, and filling. In Depression kitchens, those 3 qualities mattered more than taste. Hominy represented the foods that immigrants brought with them, techniques from the old country applied to new country poverty. The result? Families that survived when survival seemed impossible. This is the last food, the one that closes the circle, because hominy, like all 50 foods on this list, proves something important. Americans didn't just survive the Depression, they survived it with intelligence, with creativity, with determination. They turned 5-cent ingredients into family meals. They turned desperation into innovation. They turned nothing into something, and that's worth remembering. Which food did your family survive on? Drop a comment with the food name and which town or state your people are from. I'm building a map of where these survival strategies kept families alive through America's darkest economic hour. If you made it through all 50 foods, you understand something important. That survival required creativity, that poverty forced innovation, and that the families who ate these meals deserve to be remembered not for what they lacked, but for their strength in making something from nothing. Subscribe for more Depression-era history. Next video covers the company store prices that kept families trapped in endless debt cycles. From the Depression kitchens to yours, don't let them forget what our grandparents survived.